And move to the next one, please. And so the policy that we've drafted is really reflects best practices in the industry, reflects a lot of the policies that have been put in place by other CCAs that have been successfully operating. And what it really defines is, a number of things. The risk management, it starts with sort of the risk management goals and principles, and then it defines the various risks. First we define the risks, and we talk about how we measure those risks and how we report on those risks. Talks about internal control principles. So important concepts here are things like segregation of duties, defined delegation of authorities, measurement and reporting processes. And then it includes really the specific business practices related to how each of those risks are assessed and managed. And then finally, it addresses risk management and governance. So that's really sort of the roles of the board, this committee, and what ultimately would be set up a risk oversight committee or a ROC. So it sort of lays out the roles and responsibilities of those governing bodies. And move on to the next one. So in terms of the those roles, then the way that it's been presented, is being presented here, is that really this committee, the Finance and Risk Committee, would oversee implementation of the risk policy and would be able to amend the policy as it deems appropriate. Sometime before service commences in March of next year, it's expected that the FRMC would set up a risk oversight committee. We don't think it's necessary at the moment. I think as we get closer to the launch, it would be appropriate to set up the risk oversight committee, and that's really the committee where the nuts and bolts of the work will be done. That's the committee that would receive the reports, per the policy. We're proposing in the policy that committee, the ROC, would meet quarterly. Some CCAs like to convene a risk oversight committee on a monthly basis, and others think quarterly is sufficient. So we're proposing quarterly. Of course, it could always be convened, by request of the chair, or if you prefer a monthly, we could certainly modify the policy as well. The ROC would, more or less report to the FRMC and, report to the FRMC, business out of the ROC on a quarterly basis. The ROC would also adopt more specific risk management guidelines. So these would be things like specific hedge targets, specific credit policies about how much, what types of limits would be put into place for, let's say, different entities that have different credit ratings. Kind of more of the specifics of the, the policy is more of a framework, and then these guidelines are more of the detail. And the thinking that it would be done through the ROC as opposed to in the policy is, you may want to adapt those guidelines on a fairly frequent basis, whereas the policy generally you probably expect it would have a little bit more durability. And also there are some commercially, I'd say, sensitive issues in setting up those guidelines, and whereas this committee obviously is a public forum, the ROC typically would not be, and so some confidential information can be discussed, which would include these guidelines. And similar to that, the certain transaction limitations would be similar to those guidelines, would be set by the ROC. And then in terms of one of the safeguards here in risk management in this policy in particular is any violations of the policy, that it's important that there's a report out, right? There's a process for reporting those. We've written this up as using sort of the term gross violations or maybe substantive violations. If there's a minor, let's say we're a little out of position and there's a good reason for it, that's not necessarily a violation of the policy, and that can be corrected. But if there was something egregious, maybe personnel were trading beyond limits or doing something like that, then those types of things would be reported by the ROC to the FRMC. And then the ROC would also periodically review the policy and then recommend any changes to the FRMC that it deemed appropriate. Then the next slide addresses the delegation of authority, and I don't think there's been any change here in terms of what was discussed last time, but just to kind of put a bow on this, this is one of those important safeguards where the authorizations are limited, and here we have just sort of two tiers. We have the Chief Executive Officer. It would be authorized to transact per these limitations here, and the limits are really threefold. There's a tenor limit, so that's the length of the contract in terms of years or months, a volumetric limit, and also a notional value limit, so total dollar value of the contract. So as long as the contract falls within all three of those limits, then the CEO would be authorized to execute that. Anything beyond that would require a board approval. And we may at some point want to insert ROC in the middle here, where something that exceeds the CEO, but maybe is would with longer terms or larger value could potentially be approved by the ROC, and then what goes beyond that authority could be taken to the board. But for now, since we really don't have the ROC set up, we'll just set it up with these two tiers. And then on just the last slide here for this segment is the action. So what we're asking is that the committee recommend that the board, so at the next board meeting, adopt the risk management policy and including the delegation of authority. And then until the point where the ROC is formed, again, we'd expect that sometime early in next year, that a ad hoc committee be established to review contracts and to be sort of privy to some of those commercially sensitive details around price and other matters. So at some point the ROC could take that on, but in the interim, we would be looking to establish an ad hoc committee for contract review.
Thank you, John. Any questions? Councilmember West.
Yes. Great presentation. I think we've seen it a couple times, so I'm very comfortable with it. But one question I have is, a couple things. On the ROC, we keep talking about we're going to set it up sometime next year. I want to make sure that we're doing that in a timeline that gives them enough time to get up to speed. So, because this isn't something I think we can just form and roll right into. If they're not fully prepared for what they're going to get to, they think that could be detrimental. So, how much are we looking like? Where is it? What's the timeline looking like that you think we're going to need to execute? Is it 6 months prior, 3 months prior? I mean, yeah.
Yeah, well, there's flexibility. I think it's not necessary in the next few months, and really I think the bulk of the ROC's work will be taking place after the contracts have been pulled together, and there's an ongoing kind of risk monitoring and reporting. So that's why we were thinking, and so we would expect that would commence really probably in April of next year, right? We start phase 1 service in March, and then we start, the rock process thereafter. So, if the rock were to be formed in, say, January or something like that, I think that would work. You could form it earlier, though. There's absolutely no reason not to. It's just kind of how much time you have as board members.
Great, John. Thanks. I think just like to see, the next committee that, hey, let's really start looking at when we're going to bring the rock together. And then would you go back to the slide that's got the approval process? Yeah, this one. I wonder if we should, since we know that the rock is going to be somewhere in this approval, I wonder if we should put another line down, a line between the CEO and then one for the rock and then SDCP board. And then we could put over here when formed. So we don't, I was thinking about laying the foundation with the board when we go to them, that they know that the rock is there's going to be another step before it comes to the board. I mean, Greg, what do you think? I mean, at least everyone will know now that that's how the process will go in the future.
Yeah, I think that's a good idea. And we know that it's coming. Also, I think that will temper any concerns that someone might have with respect to the level of authority that the CEO has on the front end, potentially.
Yeah, totally. Okay. And then ad hoc committee. So what are we looking at for the timeline, the time frame of the ad hoc committee? Because there's some, I know I've been on like 12 different ad hocs since I've been on council. I know that there's some very strict timelines and the committee. So can you walk me through a little bit on what we're thinking about for the ad hoc committee formation? Or maybe that's a question for Cody.
Well, yeah, that's what I was wondering. If Cody, did you want to address that?
Yeah, John, I can, but feel free to add in. So I think it's going to be as needed for contracts, right? So right now we could talk maybe every time we have a solicitation close, we'd have one meeting. So it's going to be somewhere less than monthly, but maybe more than quarterly. Is that a good estimate, John, for now?
Yeah, that sounds about right. I think it's going to be more frequent over the next pre-launch, and then once we get through that process, I think it would be maybe even annual, honestly, but or a couple of times a year. So I think in terms of timing, the RFO, right, that is later on this agenda, but that would be a real good reason to convene the ad hoc committee to participate in that process, or to review recommendations and proposals coming out of that process.
And I think it's particularly helpful early on because we're new and these are new contracts and this is a new process. So perhaps a little bit more early on, and then once we all get comfortable with everything, and especially when the rock is formed, it will be less often.
Yeah, so I think that would kick it off, and then there'll be reason to meet, multiple times this year. We'll be doing other types of contracts. At some point, we'll be doing master agreements with various suppliers. It's primarily oriented towards system power purchases, but that's a whole sort of different set. So we got the RFO, which would be long-term renewable contracts, right? So that's kind of one type of power contract, and oftentimes those are new projects that are going to be built. So there are construction milestones and things like that. So those are a different type of contract. And then just sort of some of the run-of-the-mill system energy purchases that you have, those are more standardized in terms of those contracts, but there'll be a lockbox credit structure, and I'm not sure how much that's been discussed yet, but there's multiple agreements that just create the credit structure for those types of transactions where, you know, since we're a startup, we don't have a lot of capital to put up collateral, things like that. The common approach is that the suppliers have a security interest in the lockbox revenues. And
Yep.
so I imagine you've had some exposure to that, but that's, you know, that's another reason I think to get the ROC involved, just to really get up to speed so that, you know, there's a real good background in how those agreements, you know, work together, because those will be common. And so I would expect those to be starting to be negotiated over the next, you know, probably a month out before we really start that process, but, you know, coming up pretty soon.
I just, the one thing, that's great. Sounds perfect. I just, with an ad hoc committee, they have very defined timelines. I mean, you to bring up an ad hoc committee, I think they have to have a specific start and how long it's going to form for. So we can't have it. I don't think you can, there's some, just make sure that when we present this to the board, you know what I'm talking about, right?
Yeah, that's a good point. I believe they're annual, and I meant to check with Ryan before this meeting, and I'm just going to put him on the spot and ask him here. But I believe it's annual, and so if you form it now, it expires at the end of the year. But Ryan can chime in and correct me.
Yeah, you usually put a time or term on it so it doesn't form into sort of a rolling committee with a permanent subject matter. I'd have to double check if it's annual. That sounds about right. But it would have to be sort of a discrete committee with a discrete focus in a discrete timeline.
Yep. Thanks, Ryan. I appreciate it. So I just think when we bring this to the board, we need to have that. We need to know exactly what that's going to be, and because they've got to. It'd be great to make sure that we have that delineated. So when we bring it to the board, they know exactly it's going to stand up. It's going to be for this long, and this is what we're expecting it to do. And that's all.
Great.
Okay, so we've got, you're looking for action on this? And so it's I think there's two parts to this. One is the recommendation of the risk management policy, including delegation of authority, with the modified amendment that we highlight the ROC in that. I don't think we have the parameters of the ROC per se, the values, but that maybe we do some dashed lines or something that ROC to be added in later on. Does that sound?
Yeah, we'll make it.
Okay, Mark?
Of that.
Yep, that's great.
So I'll recommend that we approve staff's recommendation with that minor modification.
Yep. And then the other thing I think is just the ad hoc committee. When we bring it to the board, I want to make sure that that is defined so the board knows what it is.
And so
is that fair?
That sounds good. Are you seconding my recommendation, Mark?
Yes, second.
All right. No worries. That's what I thought it was. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Hands up. Are we good? Okay. Moving on to
Greg, you're doing a great job, by the way. You're killing it.
I've been to way too many council meetings. Item 6 is discussion and recommendation to board regarding approval of 2020 request for proposals for long-term renewable energy.
And
All right.
I had an eye on the Clean Energy Alliance meeting. I see it ended seconds ago. So Kirby just switched over, which is great.
Indeed I did. Good afternoon, everyone.
Good afternoon.
Kirby should be ready then. He's like one meeting to another.
Nice timing.
Did you say ready for a drink or ready? Anyway, yeah. So what we're going to cover here is an item that's related to one of your key procurement responsibilities as a retail seller in the state of California. You've heard before and are familiar with, at least generally speaking, California's renewables portfolio standard, which works towards a 60% renewable procurement mandate by 2030. And within that particular requirement, there is another layer that exists for long-term renewable energy contracting. So SB 350, are we able to advance? Perfect, okay. So SB 350 basically created this obligation, and now if you're a retail seller in the state of California, you need to buy a minimum 65% of your mandated renewable purchases through long-term contracts. So that's what we're talking about tonight. is your first kind of agency administered solicitation in that regard. So what we're recommending in terms of the approach, and subject to your feedback, of course, is a coordinated procurement effort with your neighboring community choice aggregation program, Clean Energy Alliance. And we believe that that would create a number of efficiencies that might not otherwise exist. And I'll touch on those in a minute. But in terms of the process, the idea would be that the solicitation would be released by your organizations jointly, characterizing your aggregated long-term renewable energy needs. So I think that also is kind of a benefit in and of itself, where there's a little bit like of obscurity, if you will, in terms of what each of you are actually buying, in terms of just kind of market intelligence generally. And then through the process of evaluating these proposals that come in, to the extent that you are, both of your organizations are interested in moving forward with the same proposal, there would be a shared arrangement under which you would decide as to how the volumes that would be expected for delivery under those sorts of agreements would be divided between your respective organizations, and then separate contracts would be entered into between SDCP and the supplier and Clean Energy Alliance and the supplier. So there would be no joining together in a literal sense of these procurement processes. So it's really, the process moves forward. You all are working cooperatively. When it comes to the point of contracting, there would be efficiencies generated by virtue of the fact that hopefully anyway, you could streamline the use of legal counsel in drafting those documents and not have redundancies there, streamline the evaluative process and not have redundancies there, save some costs along the way in terms of legal expenses and so forth. And then when you get to the point where you've got a form document that's ready for approval, you would take that back to your respective governing boards, because it's a long-term agreement, and that's what's kind of required or will be required per your risk management policy. Approve those documents, execute them independently, and away you go from that point forward, taking your respective renewable energy deliveries independent of one another. So that's kind of the idea there in terms of the process. And maybe we could go ahead and move on to the next one. Okay, so I mentioned before about SB 350 and the long-term contracting requirement. Just as a reminder to this group, when we talk about long-term contracts, we're talking about contracts of 10 years or longer. So, 9.5 years, not good enough. 10 years or more. So that's the standard, and 65% of your requirements need to be filled through these sorts of contracts. So when you think of what the mandate means in terms of like a net effect on your procurement responsibilities, it's really a percentage of a percentage. So the overall renewable portfolio mandate in 2021 is a little over 35%, I believe. And so it would be 65% of 35% needs to be your long-term contracting obligation. And then that's summed over the compliance period, which in the case of your initial operations would include 2021, 2022, 2023, and 2024. You sum those together, and if you buy all the long-term contracts you need, no problem. If you miss, there are financial penalties, so you don't want to do that. The table here, the small table at the bottom, is kind of a quantification of the renewable energy requirements for SDCP that would be embedded in the joint solicitation. So these are yours. Clean Energy Alliances would be layered on top of this by virtue of the fact that they're much smaller than you are. You're kind of making up the lion's share of the volume that's being quantified in the solicitation, but that's just fine. I think in working through the evaluative process of these proposals, that may well inform kind of the split that you choose to pursue when contracts of interest arise.
Hey, Kirby.
Yes, please.
I got a question for you. So with our renewable energy portfolio, with this standard that's set forth, is the different cities' climate action plans, I imagine, because each one of our cities has a different timeline that they have put forth where we want to be on 100% renewable. In fact, you know, like IB's at 2030 and some of the other cities are at 2035. Does that affect this at all? Or is that, and I'm wondering, do we need to be tracking that to make sure each one of the cities is meeting their goals?
Yeah, so that's a good question. I think I'm not sure how Cody would choose to respond, but I would probably suggest that to the extent that your individual member communities have climate action goals that necessitate transitions towards large levels or 100% renewable energy use, that's an item, as I see it, that would be reflected in subsequent solicitations. So we talked about this concept that there are going to be numerous solicitations administered over time for SDCP. You know, you're going to participate in the solicitations administered by others, as is the case with the San Diego Gas and Electric administered renewable solicitation. You're going to administer your own solicitations. And so to the extent that there is an inflection point at which one of your member communities needs to step up its renewable energy volumes or transition outright to 100% renewable energy, I think what we would need to know in supporting your procurement efforts is simply when that transition is expected to occur, so we can make sure that we embed those volumes in any upcoming solicitations. Is that kind of I know I didn't maybe directly answer your question in terms of tracking the climate action plans of individual communities, because I think that may be somebody else's task, but in terms of how that impacts the procurement process, I don't know, hopefully the information I just provided was a little helpful.
Yeah.
No, Kirby, that was great. I think it's almost like a discussion that the board needs to have, because I think if every community has their own goal, it's going to be really tough it'll make things more challenging to, so maybe we should all be on the same page when we have our own goals. But what do you, Cody, if you want to add in anything on that, please do.
Yeah, so in our JPA, we talk about getting to 100% renewable by 2035 or sooner. That's to acknowledge that some of us have 2030 and some of us have 2035 dates. I think as an organization, we'll probably try to align around a date, and that's, I'm guessing, going to be 2030, but we don't know yet. What Kirby's talking about here, and what we'll, I think, continue to talk about, is that this procurement is a piece of our portfolio.
Yeah.
So we are going to be layering in all of our needs until we get to where we need to be around 2030, or you know, we're planning for that a year or two in advance. So while we don't have to procure for that 2030 number in full now, we are starting to think about working backwards and how to make sure we have our eye on that target, if that makes sense. So
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
Kirby's answer.
No, that was good. That's good.
And Cody, you bring up a really good point that's probably worth mentioning now, is that, you know, when we look forward at, you know, the contracting efforts that you're going to put in place, and in particular long-term contracts, you know, you start these things and you almost forget about them because they go so far into the future. I mean, you know, board compositions change and staff compositions change, and, you know, and of course we have mechanisms that we use, deal capture systems, to make sure that all the pertinent details of those transactions kind of stay front of mind as we move forward. And furthermore, when you're setting up these long-term contracts, it's also really important to make sure that you kind of stagger them out a little bit, so you don't wind up with what we refer to as planning cliffs, where you wind up with all contracts expiring at the same point in time. And that's kind of, you know, for now, that's what we're here to make sure that it doesn't happen, you know, at the back end of these deals. So as we line these proposals up and evaluate them, that you're going to get through this process, that's one of the things that we're definitely going to want to talk about, and just make sure you're aware of how it is that we're staggering not only the start points for these deals, but also the end points, so we don't wind up with just a big drop off where all of a sudden we're having to hit the market really hard at one point in time and expose ourselves to that risk. I mean, that's kind of, you know, part and parcel to the item that John just covered.
Got it. Thank you.
Yeah. All right, I think we can move on to the next slide. All right. So what are we actually trying to buy here in this thing? These requirements on this on the slide, they kind of orientate you a little bit to what it is that we're speccing out in terms of the RFP document. Clearly, you know, the interests of your organization are to not use unbundled RECs or bucket 3 RECs, so we are not accepting offers for those products. That probably goes without saying, but we are accepting offers for bucket 1 and bucket 2, or portfolio content category 1 and 2, renewable energy resources. And those are commonly referred to, as you've probably heard now several times, as bundled renewable energy resources, which means that the energy and the environmental attributes are both delivered to the buyer. So that's of course separate and distinct from the unbundled REC, which is kind of peeled off from the energy, sold separately. And in, you know, many programs, many individual customers out there kind of look at that as greenwashing, so we don't want to buy that stuff. Resource locations. We're looking for resources that are generally, in the case of bucket 1, physically located within the state of California or directly interconnected to the state. In the case of bucket 2, these resources are going to be located out of state. And candidly, it's probably unlikely that we're going to get any bucket 2 long-term offers, if I just had to guess. If you do get them, they'll be few and far between. And most of those products are sold on, say, like a 1 to 3 year basis. That's just kind of the nature of those deals. But nonetheless, I think it's important to solicit the information. And in the case that we get something that seems like it's worthwhile, that could be a lower cost means by which you could reach your renewable energy goals. So that's why we're including it. Minimum project size. So you're going to hear this a lot. Cody just mentioned it, and I'll mention it again. You know, you see 10 megawatts, and of course, that's obviously kind of exclusive in terms of how it prohibits the participation of smaller resources that might be, you know, located in your service territory. But again, this is a process here with this RFP that's going to dovetail with other processes that you're going to undertake. And so opportunities for smaller scale renewables will be carved out separately. Items like feed-in tariffs and so forth are very common in supporting those sorts of resources because they are competitively disadvantaged in these larger solicitations by virtue of their price. So these smaller projects oftentimes have prices that are somewhere between, say, 10 and often 50% higher than what's available on more of a utility or larger scale. And so we don't want to throw those in the same bucket and risk just, you know, kind of sweeping them aside by virtue of the fact they just simply can't compete on a price basis. So we'll carve out something separately for those projects a little bit later down the road. And then in terms of the energy deliveries that we're considering, we've kind of banded the mins and maxes in each year that will accept proposals, and that starts at a range of 75,000 to 250,000, and then works up to 100,000 and 500,000 as the boundaries. And what that's intended to do is basically create portfolio diversity by virtue of the fact that you can't have some single massive project step in, give you all your renewable energy that you need, and then subject the organization to all that risk that might happen if, say, the project comes on later than expected, doesn't come online at all, fails at some point during its operating history, or the developer you know, fails in its own right. So banning these mins and maxes just helps promote that portfolio diversity, supplier diversity, project diversity, and usually with that some geographic diversity in terms of your supply mix. And we believe that's really important to preserve. And then in terms of the initial energy deliveries, we've also banded the start and end date. So the start date is, you know, obviously lining up with your expected launch date, and then persists for a little over 2 years, because we don't want to leave this too open-ended and wind up with proposals that, you know, for projects that aren't going to come online until 2025. You know, those projects can participate in a future solicitation. For now, we want to focus on projects that are either currently operational and capable of starting deliveries within this window, or will come online as new builds during this period of time, kind of addressing your early stage renewable energy needs. So those are some of the key parameters that we're looking at in terms of the requirements. We've also spec'd out items like the form in which pricing needs to be provided. But I would say those are technically nuanced, so we didn't include them here, but just know that this isn't an extensive list of all of the different requirements. There are a variety of others that are built into the document as well. So if we can move on, that'd be great. All right, so in terms of the schedule, so interesting that the Clean Energy Alliance board meeting just wrapped up, because a little update for you here. If you choose to move forward with them, there might be a minor shift in this schedule, which I don't necessarily think is problematic, but it's important that you're aware of it. And since the meeting is done and the information's hot off the press, we might as well share it with you right now. Clean Energy Alliance decided that their board would like to actually review the RFP document itself. It was apparently decided that that document would not be shared with the board. They wanted to see it. And so they're going to establish a special meeting that is likely to occur during the week of June 29th. And then wanted a chance to look at the document before the RFP hits the streets. And so I expect that this date might shift by, say, a week to 10 days. And, you know, certainly open for discussion between your organizations as to how that date might be set. But I would think that, you know, setting the release date right up against a known holiday weekend, even in the current environment, probably isn't a great idea, because it may be likely to fall through the cracks. So I think you just want to time that so it, you know, falls kind of early in a work week and not up against a holiday weekend. And
Hey,
then,
Kirby.
yes, please.
So, one, did CEA give a reason why they wanted to review the RFP? I mean, is there any particular reason to review it?
You know, that's a good question. I wouldn't say it was like a I don't want to use the word good reason or term good reason, but they just wanted to see it. I think it's more of a curiosity for them, honestly. With this being their first renewable energy solicitation, I think they just wanted to get a better sense for what that document looked like, how it was organized, and you know, the full extent of the information that was included. And you know, that's certainly fine. It wasn't. I would say it wasn't a decision where, you know, that document was like deliberately withheld. It was just, I think, an assumption that was made by that program's leadership that that review of the document might not necessarily need to occur. So, you know, they gave different direction, and that's yeah.
I don't want to.
Oh, sorry, Mark. I was just going to add a little bit to that. I can't remember because I've reviewed so many documents, if it's here or if it's in our staff report for the board, where we essentially summarize the RFP. Is it in
Yes.
the PowerPoint or is it in our staff report? I can't recall.
Well, it's kind of a little bit of both.
Okay.
You know, yeah, I think we've got some of the high points in here. We've already covered some of them, but yeah, there's definitely additional items that are noted in the staff report itself. So, you know, I think the thought process was between the two items, whether the document was shared in its entirety, the key information would kind of be covered. And I'll tell you all, you know, just while we're talking through this item now, this is the format that we are recommending that you deploy to get this information out has been used on numerous occasions by CCAs, and it's been pretty darn successful in getting the information out there. And the good news in terms of using something that the market's already a little bit familiar with is that they're well orientated to it, and they can move through it pretty quickly and get to the punchline and start preparing their responses. So, you know, I'm not suggesting that a review shouldn't be completed or you know, that's a terrible idea by any stretch, but I think if you know, kind of take staff's word for it, it is a format that is kind of tried and true, if you will, in terms of getting key information out there. And then I would point out also that, you know, to the extent that there's a nuanced interest that you have, say that might be related to evaluative criteria or something like that, the document, the RFP document itself very carefully states that the list of evaluative criteria is non-exhaustive and subject to change. So if there is an item that you think of after seeing one of these proposals and consider all of a sudden, oh my gosh, we need to really key in on this as part of our evaluation, that can happen. The flexibility is embedded to do that. So, that I think what the document looks like when it goes out is more of a key informational summary, and then all of the details, including any specific interests or focus areas that you might have during evaluation. Those can all be considered at that time.
So I'm kind of getting a little. At first, I was thinking that this was. I was kind of like, why would they want to review that? It doesn't seem like that important. But now I'm starting to think that maybe we all maybe both organizations should review it. So I think. Cody, does this affect our timeline significantly? If they're going to take a little time to review it, it kind of gives us more of an opportunity to take a look at it as well. What do you think, Cody?
Yeah, so what we can do, and we were kind of taking the approach that for thinking at a city government level, we typically don't share proposals, requests for proposals with our councils, but we bring back the gist of what we asked for and then how we narrowed it down and scored it. So that was the approach that we're sort of taking here. But since we are going to the board next week, we can attach the full RFP to the full board if that's what you all want to see as well. It's not something we typically do, but it's something we're happy to do. And we will also summarize the important things, and we're going to get to a discussion about criteria, which I think is something that's probably more of interest to you all, how to evaluate these types of things on the other end when we get them in. We don't really necessarily want to limit ourselves on the search. We want to limit ourselves on what we pick out of that search, if that makes sense.
Got it. Yeah. Okay. So I think I like the idea of attach. I think that scratches my itch there. So thank you.
Okay, so that's kind of that was the idea here on this slide regarding schedule, but we're clearly going to push that just a touch, and I think a relatively minor amount of movement doesn't change many things, should allow you to get through the contracting process by the end of the year, shortly thereafter.
Kirby, sorry to interrupt you. Will you remind me of, since it's hot off the press, what was the date that they wanted to delay the release?
Well, okay, so that's a good question too. There wasn't a specific date that was identified. I will just the information that was discussed was convening the special meeting during the week of June 29th. So I think if that happens, you'd probably be looking at like an earliest possible release date of the following week. So following the holiday weekend.
And maybe we'll know more by the board meeting, our own board meeting next week. My own hesitancy, and Kirby, you could tell me if I'm wrong, is to delay this too much, because unlike CEA, we have a lot of power we need to buy.
Yes.
So I don't want us to drag our feet.
I agree with you. And I think, a 1 week slip doesn't give me any pause at all. Or if we started talking about a month or more, I'd start getting kind of nervous.
Just
the other thing that's probably worth noting here in terms of just lining up the pieces is that there's you all have already discussed and approved participation in San Diego Gas and Electric's renewable energy RFO. Responses to that are now due on Monday. And I believe that they're intending to notify shortlisted buyers really just before this solicitation was expected to go out. Matter of fact, in a week. So that timing is also really useful in the sense that you'll have some good information as to whether or not any of your bids are pulled. And if they are, then of course, we'd be looking at maybe selecting different proposals in terms of the quantities of energy that might be delivered. So I think this is, even if it slips a week, no problem. You know, that's still good timing, because you still line up the pieces in a way that that provides you useful information and allows you to complete your evaluation process with that information in mind.
I have to admit, I'm less than optimistic that we will have a 1 week slip. I think based on the dates on here, that June 29th is a Monday. People are going to be taking, 4th of July. I think you're looking at least 2 weeks is probably that's a really aggressive timeline, in my opinion. I think you're looking at longer, and that makes my concern with this whole timeline. So I think it's really important that we find out exactly what CEA, what they're looking at their timeline and how they expect this to get this back. Because if we're going to be balancing our life with both of the organizations, we're taking a bigger risk than they are because of our power procurement.
Yeah, point well taken, no doubt. And I think if there was, and for what it's worth, this was made pretty clear, during the Clean Energy Alliance meeting, I think as well, that, to the extent that there was an interest of either organization in just, moving forward on their own timeline, they could do that, and just release the RFP independently. So, if you get to a point where you feel like there's uncertainty about how this is going to move forward and so forth, then you can always, for what it's worth, we've already drafted the documents in both forms, both for you as an independent entity and with CEA as well. So that was also, I'd say, somewhat deliberate when this conversation popped up, that we left the forms of the document in both with both processes in mind.
Okay, thank you.
Yes. Okay, so next slide. All right, so here are some of the key criteria that I would say regularly show up, not only in CCA solicitations, but also in solicitations for renewable energy, generally speaking. And it really kind of spans a pretty broad spectrum of considerations. And of course, you'll notice here, we haven't bothered to ascribe any weighting criteria or prioritization necessarily to any of these factors. That's really for you to decide. And I would recommend against being overly detailed in how it is that you spec that out when you release the RFP, because I think it sets up the opportunity for respondents to overemphasize certain information for the benefit of a proposal ranking. And you may have experienced this in your own lives, in business along the way, where in proposals it's very easy to include puffery and make things look a little bit more important and significant than they really may be. And that can certainly pervert the evaluative process in a way that you really don't want. So, just at a high level and kind of in terms of the categories here, you'll see at the top, price. It kind of goes without saying, right? If you can't get renewable energy at a particular price, you risk violating kind of the budget that you've established, and with that, customer rates. And then, of course, items like administrative quality of the response and completeness and so forth, those are also important. And I think it's also characterized in the RFP that those would be items that would be considered. And of course, you'd be able to reject a proposal based on the lack of administrative completeness or lack of attention to certain requirements. Project location and benefits to the local economy, those kind of go hand in hand, I think. Clearly for a new build, the extent to which you'd have impacts on the workforce is greater. And so we would potentially want to consider those as well. And then the next group is really kind of within the development bucket. You may receive proposals for operational projects. In those cases, all these risks are really off the table. But for new build projects, these are really the laundry list of items that you just want to make sure you have a good handle on at the time that you get the proposal, to make sure that it's a viable development schedule based on the level of progress that's been made at the time the proposal was submitted. And I think we've done this enough over the years where we've got a pretty good sense for which of these items need to be well in hand based on the expected delivery start date, in order to really strongly consider a particular proposal. And then we've got some environmental considerations. Is the project going to necessitate significant mitigation measures or other work in order to deal with those environmental impacts? And then lastly, this is actually pretty important and is directly related to those volumetric limits that I talked about previously, is just promoting supplier diversity, not wanting to put all your eggs in one basket. Of course, you're a big enough program that it'd be pretty hard to put all your eggs in one basket, but nonetheless, being kind of overweighted with a particular supplier, particular technology type, particular geographic area, that can all have consequences. And that's why, banning those volumes in a way that promotes the recruitment of, mini projects for the sake of diversification, that's certainly recommended. Any kind of questions or comments? There are certainly other items that, you could include, and it's really limitless, but these strike us as some of the key parameters that are typically considered in these processes.
Not for me.
I'm good.
Okay. All right. So moving right along. So that's all the material we had today, and it sounds like bringing this to the board along with the draft RFP itself is a desire of this committee, and so I think the action today would just be looking for a recommendation from you all to move this forward, so long as it looks okay when you see the full RFP next week with the board.
Yeah, I think that sounds good. Just a quick comment and question. I like the fact that we're collaborating with CEA on doing this. That makes sense. Who is our liaison with CEA? How is that? Is that you, Cody?
Yeah.
Okay. Just so I understand who we're talking to talk to them. But it is important that we do keep to our schedule. And as Mark mentioned, a little slip I think is okay, but really important that we do keep to the schedule. And then just a kind of an overall purchasing question. In purchasing law allows piggybacking on contracts. Do energy contracts work that way at all? Because often there's efficiencies that can be gained of somebody already issued a contract to an LA power authority, and when they did that, there was potentially a piggyback provision where another CCA could say, we want to take advantage of that.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I think within the electric utility space, particularly for these long-term deals, that's probably an opportunity that doesn't exist. And the reason I say that is because when these offers are made to individual, say, retail sellers, other CCAs, the investor-owned utilities and such, they're generally being offered up kind of in their entirety or as a kind of a syndicated opportunity that's being subscribed in mass. So if, let's say, you have a 500 megawatt, like a very large solar array, the way that'll work is all of the contracts will be lined up to subscribe all of or almost all of that 500 megawatts, so that entity can go out and pursue financing, because that's typically the way that this happens in the electric utility space. Is these contracts are the basis for getting the deal financed, and it's the credit worthiness of the buyer, at least the perceived credit worthiness, that usually kind of carries the day in terms of getting one of these deals done. And so when you think about, whether or not there might be like a piece of a puzzle that you could grab. I think that's kind of what you're referring to. If there was a 200 megawatt facility and maybe it's only 150 megawatts is subscribed. Yeah, that you might find that, say, a proposal to you is for that last 50 megawatt piece or for the first 150 megawatts. It's really kind of hard to say, but I can't think of too many instances where, those sorts of connections aren't orchestrated through joint solicitations like this. And I think that's actually something that this kind of helps enable, is rather than leaving like a little piece unaddressed, which could delay the project completion, hopefully going at this with another entity kind of closes that loop. So you're actually, like not having these little pieces that you're referring to. But yeah, I really haven't seen that come along too often. It's usually a response from an entity that needs to close out the last 50 megawatts of a big project in order to get financing. And that's usually an opportunity that's brought to you by the developer of the project, say, rather than a neighboring utility or something.
Yeah, that makes sense. This is a complicated purchasing thing, and the piggyback provision is a simpler way to do it. But I think we're doing the next best thing is that we're partnering with another agency.
Yeah, I agree. And I think another neat opportunity that you have is, let's just say you get a really great deal and it's too big for you, as well as being too big for you and Clean Energy Alliance. Well, you have an opportunity at that point to reach out to other CCAs if you'd like and say, we really want to take advantage of this. Do you want to take a piece? And I think that's kind of creating that same opportunity that you're referring to, in maybe just like it's a less formalized way, but it can still exist nonetheless, where you reach out to your neighboring utilities or CCAs and get them involved so you could close out a really good project and get it going.
Mark, you got anything further on this?
Just was there any public comment on this particular discussion on this one? Did we get any
Sebastian?
None? Okay.
No public comment on this one. There was the previous public comment
Okay.
on the non-agenda.
Okay. No, I'm good. You've answered all the questions that I had. Thank you.
So I'm gonna make a motion to recommend that we forward the RFP to the board at their next meeting for their review.
Second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Thank you, Kirby.
You're welcome. My pleasure.
Thank you.
Okay, moving on to item 7, discussion of FY21 draft budget.
All right, Sebastian, he's going to pull it up. Don't be afraid. He's going to pull it up on an Excel spreadsheet, so it's a little bit bigger.
Thank God. I've got terrible eyes.
I think I'm going to pull it up separately because I don't want to get much closer to my computer screen. Let's see.
If you ever see me in the water when I'm surfing and you know how bad my vision is, don't get near me.
You don't say hi because of that?
I'm thinking a lot of people, trust me.
Would you like me to zoom in a little bit more?
Yes.
I'm good.
I'm good.
Okay.
Okay.
Okay. Okay, so I'm just going to run you through this. So if you recall, we adopted a budget back in October, I believe, or I think at our first meeting for the last year. And so now we're adopting an FY21 budget. So this, in reviewing our JPA document, apparently we were very prescriptive in there about when our fiscal year is, and we dictated that it needs to be July 1st, 2020 to June 30th, 2021. It's an easy thing to assume since all of our local governments are on that same schedule. So that being the case, we need to bring this forward to the committee and the board now. And so what we're presenting here is our estimated FY21 budget. Thankfully, we've worked out all of our financing information, so we actually have a budget to work with, which is nice. And so we have a lot of detail here for you. I'm definitely open to feedback on consolidating this a little bit more for the board, or at least not spending a ton of time on it, but at least for you all, I wanted to share a little bit more detail since it's our first kind of real budget and making sure you understand what goes into it. So of course it starts with our revenue, which shows our working capital from River City Bank, which is the $5 million we worked pretty hard for. And then with the launch of service beginning with municipal accounts in March, based on our pro forma, we have an estimated additional revenue of just 1.3 million for that for this fiscal year. And so that totals about 6.3 million in revenue that we have coming in for fiscal year 21. And I wanted to start by saying this is a draft budget. We've gone through these and made pretty good estimates of everything, but we're still tinkering with a few things. This is draft. Just running through the expense lines, I'll go fairly quickly, but please feel free to stop me as you like to ask any questions. So we have a first category is our general kind of operations and administration. So this is everything from several of our consulting services we already have on board. And in the notes column there, you see we break them out for information. So we have Lean Energy, which is Sean Marshall's contract that started in January 1st. I'd like to bring on an accounting firm. We're estimating that at 150, but it will be actually lower than that. We just started paying our bills finally, now that we have money in the bank. We set up our bank account with River City Bank. We have multiple accounts with them, and we currently have, I think, about nine or 10 City of San Diego staff in the process of paying our bills. And it takes that many people because you need the internal controls process the same people cannot set up a vendor that are allowed to set them up for payment, and the same person that sets a vendor up for payment cannot be the one to approve it. It's a series of steps for internal controls, and they're very appropriate, and it's a way to be secure with our funding and making sure that everything is safe. That's a lot of city staff time, it takes a lot of time, and we're paying for it. Whereas if we hired an accounting firm, this is their expertise, and it's a firm that we wouldn't have to bring in-house as we transfer away from City of San Diego. I think it's a good use of our time, and they also can help us with separate internal controls, with payments, and set us up with a payroll firm and also an auditing mechanism when we need it. So I'm accounting for that as well, and then the HR payroll payments, and then we'll eventually need some IT contracting support as the organization expands over the next year. Board and committee expenses, we had talked about this, so we budgeted for something. This is the potential to, if we want to, and this is a discussion we could have later, allow for board and committee compensation or reimbursement of some sort for attending meetings. Currently, though, we aren't paying for meetings other than our Zoom subscription and our staff time. And when we do attend in city meetings, city council chambers, so far the city, they're letting us use those chambers at no cost.
How did you come up with that number then, Cody? How'd you estimate that board and committee?
Yeah, we looked at other compensation mechanisms. So when electeds attend other meetings,
like Sandag or
exactly, 100. I think we either had $100 or $150 per meeting per attendee, and estimated out by 12 months, and etc. So
okay, just curious.
Yeah. So, and again, it's estimated budget, so we're open to ideas. If we do decide to move forward with that policy, we'd bring that forward, and if it requires a budget adjustment, we could make that at that time. Staffing, we just made an assumption, and Sean Marshall, I forgot to mention this as well, who's not here tonight and left us. He worked on this with me and came up with a lot of the numbers along with me. Staffing assumes about 8 staff by the end of the fiscal year, and we stagger that over the 12 months. And so we came up with about a $1.5 million budget for that, which includes about a 35% overhead and benefits. Admin costs, this is just rent, insurance, equipment, IT software, etc. We put in about 400K there. I don't know what we'll be doing for rent, frankly, is the line item that I'm questioning. We want to budget for it just in case, but I imagine that's going to be a little fluid and may go down a little bit.
And the travel too, right?
Right, exactly. So,
Yeah.
exactly.
So the staffing, I think, I know that the majority, when we've talked to the board a couple times, that we had really wanted to make sure that we're trying to figure out, there are, obviously we want to hire the right people and bring that on, but I also think that I'm very interested in trying to make sure that we are working with other, or we don't hire a big staff, you know. I mean, I want a staff that is focused and managed, but long term, I don't have to pay for all the retirements. So I really would like to see, you know, to make us using as much as we can to work with other organizations that where we can fill those staffing needs and get the most bang for our buck, if you know what I mean.
Right. And I'll use the accounting firm as an example of that. So
Yeah.
because of those internal financial controls, you have to have separate staff members to do those steps, because you cannot blend those. It's not you'd get audited and you would just fail in an audit, and it's just not good practice. We'd either have to bring in 9 people in-house just to pay our bills, or we use an accounting firm who can do it for multiple agencies all at once, you know. So those are the areas that we're looking for, that type of efficiency. So I do hear you on that.
Perfect.
The next line is our CAISO and utility fees. So we're still looking at some of these numbers as well, but we'll need to make a CAISO deposit. We've already posted our bond, the CPUC. There may be an additional 40 something K in there. We'll have to look at that. And then our billing service fees with SDG&E. Again, this number looks smaller. It's because we're just launching in this fiscal year. So the next fiscal year, you'll see some bigger numbers here, but you'll also see a lot more revenue coming in. The next line is technical and energy services. So additional, this is Pacific Energy Advisors, for example, some of the work that they're doing here. Again, the notes, we kind of show some of our math. Our scheduling fees, we'll start paying those as well. And then cost of power is a big TBD. That will need to be a placeholder in here, but we'll also see the revenue increase because we'll step up our River City line of credit when that does happen. So whatever line jumps up there, we'll see a corresponding increase in our line of credit deposits. Going down the line, communications and customer enrollment. So this, if I had to roll all this up, it's going to be in this marketing and communications effort that we're putting together. And so you'll see it's about 549K total. That includes all the branding and marketing and website redesign, community engagement efforts. This is a hugely important line item for us. Launching and doing a good job of getting out there and telling people who we are and why they want to join us or stay with us. It's so critical at launch. So this is, every penny here is well worth it. And it does include the required printing of materials that we need to distribute to our customers. The law requires a certain amount to be actually printed, and the rest can be done in a more creative kind of social and online way, but there's some printing requirements.
I'll be interested to see how this part, the strategy moving forward is going to change. You know, I think this is really based on pre-COVID, you know what I mean? So it'll be interesting to, I think that this 549,000, maybe I would put something in there that says, you know, this is something we're going to have to really look at as we move forward, because we don't really know how. We're going to have to think about our communication strategy to ensure we really get to people, and how are we going to do that? So so I'm just putting that in there.
Yeah, no, it's a good point. And we just wrapped up interviews for the marketing communications RFP we had open, and some of the firms did actually already put some thought towards that, of how to still get out in the community and communicate and do outreach in light of COVID. And so there's some really good ideas out there and ways to do that safely. So yeah.
Perfect. Thank you.
Data management call center, our fees don't start until 2022. So this year seems like we're late on that one, but it's good for us in this first year. We have our legal services. We have both general counsel, who you're familiar with, and then also the additional amount of line item there specifically for commercial energy contracts. And the last section here is regulatory and legislative. So we're still working with Cal CCA and what initial membership looks like. They scale it based on the number of accounts you have. And again, in this first year, we'll have a fewer number of accounts. So we're doing a placeholder until they give us the final number. And then we have our regulatory work with TOSDL APC, who you're familiar with. And we have an additional line here where with the exit fee proceedings and the ERA filing that SDG has submitted to the CQC, we want to have a technical consultant come on board, very similar to MRW, who I think you're all familiar with, and help us really dig into the numbers and put together our responses to that proceeding and be very engaged at that front, which aligns up with I think what John talked about in the risk management policy, where one of the mitigations of some of your risk around the regulatory and legislative space is to be very actively engaged and advocate for your position. We do have a line here also for a lobbyist. That's very much a TBD line. It's very standard for CCAs to do this. So we're doing a placeholder there, but we don't have anybody on board yet or immediate plans to bring that on board. So you'll see overall operating expenditures total about 4.2 million. And with the revenues that we're bringing in, we're netting, or we have a surplus of about $2 million in our first year. I want to not celebrate that yet and just remind you this is a draft and we do still have some additional costs to add in, but so far we're doing really well. It does not include reimbursable expenses for the different cities. And we did, if you recall, the MOUs that we approved already, we put in there that they are subordinated loans. So we won't pay them back until we pay back the bank. So we have a couple of years to pay the cities back. Any questions on that? I know it's 6:20 and you're all excited to look at numbers, but.
Oh, I love numbers. Greg, what do you think about, I think for the first budget, as we're going forward, this is probably a good amount of detail that we should bring to the board for the first one. And then as we move forward, obviously scale this back. I mean, what are your thoughts, Greg?
Yeah, I think it's a good, it's basically one page. There's just enough detail in there. I like having the third column in there where things are explained out. And to me, it's very readable, explainable. I think it's a good level of detail. I agree. Quick question on staffing. And you had a 35% number in there for overhead or the benefits. Has there been any discussion on what the benefits potentially are going to entail?
I am not involved in those discussions, and Sean isn't here right now. So they're initially having those discussions with the HR firm that they brought on board, and I think they're developing that.
Because Mark brought it up, and it's going to come up. So
yeah,
be prepared for that.
I'll bring that up to Joe and Sean, and they can address that in the board meeting.
We have to be thoughtful there.
Yep.
Yes, we do.
Other than that, I think it looks good.
Wonderful.
Any other comments, Mark?
I'm good. I think she did a great job. I think, yeah.
Consensus on the draft budget, Cody.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
All right. Item 8, regular meeting schedule. We don't meet regularly. We meet whenever we decide to meet, wherever we decide to meet.
Which it's perfectly within your right to continue doing that. If you would like to set a regular meeting schedule, which makes some of our lives easier.
I would really like to set a regular meeting schedule because I cannot.
That's a good idea. Let's try to do that.
Okay.
Yes.
We've tried to help narrow it down to a few times. There's either the first or the third Tuesday of the month, and either 3 to 5 p.m. or 5 to 7 p.m. And I don't think there's consensus beyond that. So I'm just going to make you all do the hard work of being chair and directors. And
what do you think, Greg?
Both of those days work for me. My preference would be the 3 o'clock slot, but if that doesn't work, I can do the later slot. And my preference would be the first Tuesday.
Okay. First Tuesday, 3 o'clock is carried. Let's do that. I think that'd be great. And I just need to just get that information to my scheduler, and yeah, I'm in. That sounds great.
Let's make it happen.
Yep.
I'll make sure to email Sandra, Mark.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right. We're on to item 9, committee member announcements. Anything, Mark? How's the surf?
It's been great lately. It's been great. But I actually, yeah, it's been really fun. I've been having a great time. But I spent Sunday in the ER because a damn kook hit my leg with his surfboard, and it was such a But everything's fine. I think good. I
have not been in the water. If I come to IB, will you take me out?
Oh, of course. Anytime, Greg. I would love to do that. Anytime.
I have been in the water, but not any time recently.
Yes, understand. We will set up a time for sure, Greg. No worries.
Awesome.
I do think.
Right now.
What was that?
It's nice and warm right now.
It is. I do. I like the meetings, how they're going, Cody. I think you're doing a good job at managing this, and I think that the way you're rolling this out is very is easily receptive to our public, and I think the best thing we can do as we move forward is to make sure that we are continually trying to be as open as possible to make sure that all this information is getting out, and I think you're doing a good job. And I think the challenge we have is really just getting this out. How are we going to make sure that the people who aren't computer savvy can understand what we're doing? Because we just need to make sure that that's a priority as we move forward. So, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I agree. And it's getting used to meeting like this. It's actually potentially more convenient. We just have to figure out the process for the input, which is a little bit more challenging. But I see we have, looks like 8 attendees. I saw we had up to 11 at one point. So thank you for all of our attendees.
Yes.
And we have, you noticed on this meeting and for the board meetings too, we're trying to switch back to letting people read their own comments. It's a small thing, but I think it feels better, at least on my end, it feels better to have people say their comments in their own words. And we think we have enough technology in place to allow that. So we're hoping that's a little bit step in the right direction for folks.
I think it's so important. I think that using the technology and then putting blocks on it to where we're not seeing each other's faces and not is actually detrimental, because we really need, even though it's still Zoom, I need the ability to look at the people who are talking and look at them and get those nonverbal cues. And it's important. And I think that anything we can do, I know we may have a day when things go wrong and we're not able to do that, but we should make every opportunity to try to be as tech savvy and to make sure we're all in this as much as we can, because it's really important. It really is. So I appreciate that we've done this. I think some of the other boards that I sit on that are actually putting up rules that they don't want interaction like this, I think is bad for as we move forward. So yeah, thank you.
And then one thing, if I may, we had initially set a 2-hour minimum to receive any public comments, and we decreased that to 1 hour to allow more time. For this meeting, we did receive an additional public comment after the 1 hour mark for item 6. So I will go ahead and forward that to you both at the conclusion of this meeting, so to make sure that you receive those comments.
Is it appropriate just to share it now, or is that?
Yeah.
Are we not okay doing that?
It was in the form of a letter. It was. I can pull it up now if you want.
I don't know.
Well, I'd much rather share it here, but is there any reason why we couldn't? Is the general counsel, is there something that we need to know about?
No, you're fine to share it now.
I guess if it's a full letter, it's just lengthy to read, but maybe.
Isn't it like the first 100 words or something like that you're able to share on
300.
a public comment? There you go.
Yeah.
If you want to summarize it, that's fine too.
Okay.
Yeah.
Give me 1 second.
Sebastian, are you just going to read it, or are you going to actually share it on the screen? I think reading it is fine.
Okay.
Or summarizing it is fine.
Or singing it in a Gaelic form would be great.
Okay, let's see here. The comment was submitted by Micah Metrosky, environmental organizer with ABW 569 for item 6. I will forward you all the letter so you can read it in more detail. But the first paragraph says, I believe this letter was addressed initially to the board of directors, but it says, Dear Chair Mosca and SCCP board members, as you begin to define your customer products and your energy procurement plans, we urge you to incorporate the following to help ensure product offerings and the type of energy you are buying align with SDC priorities and community values. From thereafter, it goes into further detail that would take a little bit more than 3 minutes.
I've got that letter. I think that was the one that was sent to us already, right?
I believe so.
Okay.
We'll make sure you all get it again if you haven't received it.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Anything else? All right, I'm seeing at 6:30. We are adjourned.
Good job. Thanks. Appreciate it. Have a good night.
Have a good night.
Thank you all.